Welcome, everyone. My name is Carol Bassi. I'm the Director of Alumni and Parent Communities, and it gives me great pleasure to be able to present our presidential election panel. It's a quadrennial tradition at Drew University, and we're very proud to be able to do it. It's different, obviously. It's virtual, but I think that means we actually drew folks from a broader geographic diversity. So that's kind of exciting. So I'm going to get started on the introductions. We have an alumna here, Erica Jedynak. I hope I pronounced that correctly. She is a graduate of Drew University College of Liberal Arts. She's currently the Director of Economic Opportunity for the Stand Together Chamber of Commerce. As a social entrepreneur, she leads national strategy to remove barriers in government, business, communities, and education so every person can rise. Prior to Stand Together, Erica was the New Jersey State Director of Americans for Prosperity. Erica is a national spokesperson for economic issues and manages awareness and policy reform campaigns. She has been published in the Wall Street Journal and Forbes and has appeared on Fox Business, NJ News 12, and Bold TV. She also currently serves on the New Jersey State Advisory Committee for the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. Next up is Professor Jinee Lokaneeta, who is chair of the Poli-Sci and International Relations Department. Professor Lokaneeta joined Drew in 2006. She received her PhD from the University of Southern California. Prior to USC, she taught political science at Delhi University in India. She also completed her bachelor's, master's, and master's of philosophy and political science at Delhi University. She was a visiting scholar at the Center for Political Studies at a university in Delhi. I'm not going to try to pronounce the name. In 2014, and the Center for the Study of Law and Society at the University of California, Berkeley in fall of 2009. She was the book review editor of Law and Society Review from 2013 to 2016, and she is also the former president of the Consortium of Undergraduate Law and Justice Programs. Her areas of interest include law and violence, political theory, transnational law, jurisprudence, and cultural studies. Professor Patrick McGuinn is Professor of Political Science and Education at Drew University and a Senior Research Specialist at the Consortium for Policy Research and Education. He holds a PhD in Government and a Master's in Education and Education Policy from the University of Virginia and has held fellowships at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, the Rockefeller Institute for Government, the Taubman Center for Public Policy at Brown University, and the Miller Center for Public Affairs. His research interests are in national politics and institutions, education and social welfare policy, American political development, federalism, and the policymaking process. And finally, Professor Phil Mundo is a professor of political science after earning a PhD in political science at the University of California, Berkeley, and spending several years working at the Congressional Office of Technology Assessment and the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. He joined the Drew faculty in 1986. He teaches courses on American politics and public policy and has directed Drew's Washington semester program and the London semester program. Professor Mundo's research interests include American government, public policy, environmental policy, and energy policy. Of course, all three of our faculty have multiple publications, and you can find more information about them on the Political Science and International Relations Department webpage on the Drew website. So without further ado, each of our panelists is going to present for about 5 to 7 minutes and kind of move on the process, and we'll take your questions in chat. So without further ado, Professor Mundo, you are up.
Thank you, Carol. Hello, everyone. It's good to see all of you again. I see many familiar faces. I hope my face is sort of familiar to you. I thought we'd change the plan tonight. Since many of you, last time I saw you, were in the classroom, I thought each of us would speak for about an hour. And then we, after about 4 or 5 hours, no, I'm teasing, but we'll go just a few minutes. I'm going to talk about how we got where we are in the 2020 election. As it occurs to me, as I look at campaigning right now, we see what President Trump, Vice President Biden are doing, what they're trying to focus on. It's not unusual for the last weeks in the campaign to focus on the base, but they're doing it right now with a great deal of enthusiasm. President Trump is trying to rally the base, his base, with his usual kind of rhetoric to make sure that people vote. One of the main concerns of any campaign is to be sure that everybody gets out and votes. And Biden is trying to do similar things, get his supporters out, and then also target maybe the last bit of the American electorate that might still be up, may not have made up their minds collectively. They're not many folks, but it is suburban white women who seem to have lost their interest in voting for President Trump since the last time around, and may be voting for Vice President Biden this time around. What occurs to me as I watch this is a game for your own base. And it tells the story, or reveals how we got where we are now in American politics. It's a story of political polarization. It's a story of partisan divide. And we haven't seen this in a very long time. In fact, I don't know if we've ever seen this in the way we're seeing it now. I'd like to talk a little bit about that, how we got to this point, and to kind of set the stage for the presidential election, also the House elections and Senate elections, and there are some important state elections as well. If you think about the partisan divide now, with Democrats and Republicans very much lined up against each other, that is not the way it used to be in American politics. It used to be that it was possible to have liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats, parties that worked together, not because they thought that was a great idea, it's because that was a way to get things done. It wasn't the idea of bipartisanship as a goal, the idea was to get things done. And they were able to do that. To see how we got where we are, we have to go back to the 1948 election, 1948 presidential election, which was the beginning of the breakdown of the New Deal coalition. In 1948, we had a third party called the Dixiecrats, with Strom Thurmond as their presidential candidate, a white Democrat at the time, very conservative, a segregationist, and he ran on a platform of segregation and various other kinds of conservatism, and he won a number of states in that election. That signaled the breakdown of the New Deal coalition. From that point forward, we see Southern Democrats in one way or another becoming Republicans, either switching parties or as they aged out of the population, which is a nice way to put it, and new folks entered the voting age. They no longer registered as Democrats, they registered as Republicans, because being a Republican was more in line with their conservative ideology. And that's a long-term shift that's taken place ever since 1948, and you can even see evidence of that shift taking place between 2016 and 2020 elections. So that is something that is the beginning of the story. A couple other events encouraged this party sorting that we've seen. One was the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 under the leadership of Lyndon Johnson. This was a very controversial bill, a long overdue bill. And when it finally passed, with the help of some Democrats, some Republicans, and Johnson's enormous political skill, Johnson noted that the Democratic Party had probably lost the South for a generation. He was wrong about that. They just simply lost the South. The realignment, if you like, or this party sorting continued apace after the passage of the 64 Civil Rights Act. It also, we see in 1970s, Richard Nixon capitalizing on that with the Southern strategy for the Republican Party, recognizing that that's where the political power of the Republican Party was going to go. So we see all this going on in the 60s and 70s. It continues through the 80s with Ronald Reagan, capitalizing on a wave of conservatism, and then finally in the 90s with Newt Gingrich, consolidating a lot of power for conservatives in the Republican Party, pushing out the last of the moderates in the Republican Party, or even liberals in the Republican Party. The Democrats always had a combination of moderates, conservatives, and liberals, or what we would call progressives now. Now it's mostly moderates and progressives. There are very few, if any, conservatives left in it. So we see this party sorting that people went through based on ideology, but also based on other factors. Part of it is, and this research shows now, that it has to do with population density. People in urban areas, close in suburbs, tend to identify with the Democratic Party. Either they're registered with the Democratic Party or they identify with it in one way or another. People in the outer suburbs and in rural areas, that is where population is less dense, tend to be more conservative and identify with the Republican Party or members of the Republican Party. We see this urban-rural split now consistently across the United States, and it maps very nicely with the partisan divide in the United States. So we have ideology acting as part of the reason for party sorting going on in the last 50, 60 years. We also see population density as an element in party sorting in the last 50, 60 years. So what we get now are two parties that are diametrically opposed to each other, even though ideologically there are inconsistencies in both parties ideologically. we see the rise of negative partisanship, where people in one party will look at members of another party, and it's not so much that they disagree, they just don't like them. And we see, comments now where people will be unhappy if their child married somebody in the opposite party, which, think about it a little bit, that's pretty crazy. But that is the kind of thing that we're seeing now, and it's becoming part of people's political identity, if you like, an all or nothing kind of game, a zero-sum kind of game in the competition parties. That has consequences for our elections. Larry Bartels was a political scientist at Vanderbilt University, discussed the 2016 election. I'm talking about Trump and his unusualness and outsized personality and all that stuff. He said, well, not so fast. If you look at Republican voting in the 2012 election and the 2008 election, it's about the same. It was Republicans were pretty loyal to the Republican Party candidate, whoever happened to be McCain in 08, of course, and Romney in 12. They were loyal to Trump in the same way, not quite as loyal, but still loyal. It took a while for Republicans to come around. Keep in mind, Trump was never thought be able to win the nomination, and never mind win the presidency. But once it became clear he had a real shot at it, Republicans came around. We see this as evidence, again, of this party sorting and people sticking with their own parties. We see it in the election now where Trump's base is solid, something in the neighborhood of 90%, I think, of Republicans are going to vote for Trump. We also see it in the election now with Vice President Biden. I've been driving around my neighborhood near Morristown, and I live in a Republican neighborhood. And I've been driving around and walking around, and I've been seeing a lot of Biden signs. I think it's like crazy. How many of those signs are there? I've never seen so many signs for a Democrat since I've been living here. It's about 27, 28 years now. And I started imagining what those Biden signs would look like. I was redesigning them, and I was taking the Biden name out and putting in not Trump. And I think that is what we see right now, and that is a reflection of this party sorting and partisan divide. Part of that is a result of people simply not liking Trump, his leadership style, his personality, and all the things that we know about. But part of it all is also they want to vote for a Democrat. So we have all these things going on now that are playing out in the campaigns. I don't see right now this sort of thing ending. I don't see right now leadership finding a way to end it. If you look at the most recent presidents and the partisan divide, we look at George W. Bush, very divisive president. He didn't want to be. He called himself the uniter. Remember that. He wanted to bring people together. That was not his personal disposition, not his style. He thought he could, but he could not. President Obama, he was a very divisive politician, more so probably than his predecessor. He wanted to bring people together, but he could not. He was divisive. What we have different about President Trump is he's divisive and he wants to be. In a sense, he understands the lay of the land now in American politics, and he's trying to capitalize it, which probably isn't a good thing for going forward in terms of policy making or political discourse in the United States. I would like to mention one last thing about the 2016 election. When we were talking about it in the primary process and then the general election, most people thought President Trump had no chance. There was one person who thought that President Trump did indeed have a chance and thought that he might even be the likely candidate and win the election. And that's my colleague, Professor Pat McGuinn. So with that handy segue, I'd like to hand over the conversation to Pat.
Great. Well, thanks, Phil. Thanks for setting the stage there, literally and figuratively. So as Phil mentioned, 91% of Republicans intend to vote for Trump. 93%, based on poll numbers pulled out by the New York Times yesterday, say they'll vote for Biden, right? So really what this election is all about, right, given the historical context that Phil mentioned that applies to this point, is trying to peel off that 10% or so, right, of people who may be identifiers of the other party, but may be inclined to switch parties, but that's a relatively small number. But it's really about these independent voters, right? And they constitute about a third of the American electorate. And then the other piece, of course, as Phil mentioned, is voter mobilization and turnout, right? Getting your people to the polls. Doesn't matter who they support if they don't actually cast their vote to officially acknowledge that support and have it count. And I will note in this regard, I mean, two points that I think are pretty fundamental, right? One, we, at least in my lifetime, right, have not had an election during a pandemic. right? And so, we can talk about all the political science theory and modeling that we want, but this is new territory, right? And we should keep that, we should certainly keep that in mind. The other thing to keep in mind here, I think, is the context of what is evolving at this very moment, right? 2 weeks before the election, and political scientists and pundits often talk about an October surprise, right? Something that happens that's may fundamentally shake up an election in the few weeks leading up to people casting their vote. I mean, we may have had one of those surprises in terms of the release of Trump's tax returns, right? Perhaps that's not it, but maybe the October surprise, given its central role in this election, is the surge of the coronavirus right now across 35 states that are seeing an increase in cases heading into the election. Polls show, over and over again that the coronavirus, its impact on the economy, and the president's handling of coronavirus and the economy are the most important issues in the election. On the handling issue, they support Biden. They think he'd be better than Trump would be or has been. On the economy, it's about split, which is not good news for Trump because the economy is the big thing that he has been running on. And interestingly, in the poll data, the other thing that Trump has really been running on is this law and order theme in the wake of the Black Lives Matters protests that have rocked the country over the last few months. Interestingly, on the law and order issue, polls show Biden with a pretty significant advantage on that issue. Both of those things, I think, are not good news for Trump. That being said, I think is one more caveat that we need to understand, which is that people vote. Phil sort of alluded to this, right, with the not Trump sign. People vote for people or they vote against people, right? And we know from the poll data that Republicans love Trump. They are passionate about him, right? They're not just casting a vote for him because they're Republicans and they view it as their party duty. They're casting their vote for him because they love him, right? And people who love a candidate are voting for someone are much more likely to turn out, right? That crucial turnout piece, than people who feel a little wishy-washy about the candidate, which is what a lot of Democrats feel about Biden. They're not really so much voting for Biden, they're voting against Trump. In that kind of scenario, we would expect Republicans, Trump supporters, to turn out at a greater level than Democrats. Again, how the pandemic then intersects with all of that is hard to tell. And of course, that brings me to the next piece that's sort of historic and different. And we don't really know how it's going to affect the outcome of this election, which is the historically unprecedented rise in the number of early and mail-in voters that's happening across the country right now. Interestingly and significantly, we also know that Democrats, by about a 2-to-1 margin, are much more likely to vote by mail-in voters, and Trump and Republicans have already started to cast or try to cast doubt on the fairness, legality, and accuracy of that mail-in voting. We've already seen across the country at the state level Republican challenges to this mail-in voting and to the early mail-in voting. And courts are going to play a significant role in this, and they already have. Interestingly, just a few days ago, the Supreme Court, with Chief Justice John Roberts, a conservative, siding with the Democrats, actually to permit Pennsylvania to accept and count ballots that are postmarked before the election up to 3 days, but that arrive up to 3 days after the election, which is significant both because Pennsylvania is such a key swing state, but also because it indicates that Roberts may side, as he did with the Affordable Care Act, interestingly enough, with Democrats on subsequent court challenges. Which then, of course, brings us to the real possibility. We experts, quote unquote, definitely quotes in there, think, right, political scientists do, that there may very well be a situation where no winner in this presidential election is declared by the end of election night, as we are accustomed to seeing, right? In fact, it may be weeks, right, after the election before we know. Again, Pennsylvania state law, these are our national elections, but it's important to recognize that they are governed by state level laws regarding how the elections are actually run and when and how votes are cast and counting. Pennsylvania, for example, they don't allow the counting to begin for ballots until the day of the election. Right. So again, it may be a very long time before that count is complete, which brings us back to the parallel of 2000, obviously, with Bush v. Gore and the contested count in Florida, which of course ended up in the Supreme Court. Now, that being said, what's the prediction here? What are the polls? What are the pundits? What are the political scientists saying about the most likely outcome, even if we're trying to predict under very unpredictable circumstances? So the conventional wisdom, right, if you were a betting person, as they say, right, is that Democrats will actually sweep. Now, Biden will win the presidency, that Democrats will hold on to the House and indeed gain some seats, and that actually Democrats will flip enough seats in the Senate to actually gain control of the Senate, though that is much, I would say, the least certain of the three predictions right there. Biden has a 10-point lead in the national polls. I think it's important to recognize that doesn't matter at all, right? The national polls, when you're talking about a presidential election, don't matter, right? Hillary Clinton won 3 million more votes than Donald Trump in 2016, and obviously still lost, because it's all about the Electoral College, and in particular, the swing states in the Electoral College, right? Trump's not winning New Jersey. We know that, right? What we really want to know is who's going to win these key swing states. Ones, by the way, that in the Rust Belt in particular, right, that were traditionally part of the blue wall, ironically enough, seen as being sort of solidly Democratic, but that Trump was able to flip by very, very narrow margin, thousands of votes cast out of millions to his advantage in 2016, right? And this is where the news is good for Biden and the Democrats, right? More importantly, Biden's got a 6 to 10 point lead in the key swing states in the Electoral College: Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Minnesota, Michigan, right? You know, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, Ohio, and even Texas, which is pretty remarkable if you think about how conservative Texas has been traditionally, are really very, very neck and neck right now, right? Could go either way. I'm not saying Biden's going to take Texas, but the fact that he's even close speaks to the power kind of either the pro-Biden or the anti-Trump sentiment in the country right now. And if you kind of break down the demographic data, you know, disaggregate this polling data to look at sort of the key groups within each of the Biden and Trump coalitions, what you see for Biden, right, is that Biden has a 2-to-1 advantage among college educated whites, whereas Trump has about a 2-to-1 advantage among non-college educated whites. Really interesting that I'm a person who studies and teaches about education policy. Very interesting to note the importance of education in that context, right? Phil noted, right, women, particularly suburban women, seem to be solidly aligned behind Biden this time. Democrats have a traditional gender advantage, but again, the suburban women voters, a number of them peeled off for Trump in 2016. Young voters, Democrats traditionally have an advantage. Biden has it now. And African-American voters, we're seeing and people of color in general, though Trump's doing a little bit better among Latinos. Interestingly enough, Biden is actually winning the young vote, but also the elderly vote, which is perhaps somewhat surprising and a bit of a shift again from 2016, right? And so, you know, Biden's got an advantage, 58 to 35 among women nationally, but is losing 42 to 48 among men nationally. If you're looking at whites, Trump's got a 50 to 44 lead. Non-whites, Biden's got a 66 to 22 point lead, right? So again, some of the breakdowns on that. So I think, you know, again, looking most importantly at the swing state numbers in the Electoral College, it is boding well for Biden, but again, turnout will be the key. Right before we came online here today, President Obama gave a speech in Philadelphia, in the swing state of Pennsylvania, really very strongly supporting Biden, his former vice president, and really urging everyone to get out and vote. And there's a sense that, you know, kind of the thinking that the Democrats and Hillary Clinton had the advantage heading into the election in 2016 led people, particularly in those swing states, to be complacent and stay home, was the reason for their defeat. Ultimately, I will end by saying on a frustrating note, the experts who have studied the likelihood of states having post-election problems in the United States during this presidential election have highlighted that Pennsylvania is the most likely state to be a hot mess after the election, in part because of the surge in mail-in and voting, but just also because of the weak capacity and the weak systems that they have in place there to deal with it. As you will recall, Pennsylvania is, if not one of the key swing states, perhaps the key swing state, along with Florida. We saw what happened in Florida after 2000 when the systems didn't work very well. We may well see similar kinds of problems in Pennsylvania, which will lead to you know, major court challenges and fights in the days and weeks after the election as those mail-in ballots are counted. Thanks, and I've got some scenarios we can talk about what might happen after the election, which you may be interested in, and we can talk about that a little later in the Q&A.
Thank you, Professor. Next up is Professor Lokaneeta.
Thank you. So it's really wonderful to be a part of this panel and see so many former students, some who, when I first joined, they were students here, and some very recent graduates. So it's wonderful, and I hope you don't compare notes about my teaching then and now. All right. So with that, so what I'm going to actually talk about is sort of thinking about enduring images, right? So basically thinking about what are some issues that have come up in the context of this election, which are going to remain even after these elections, right? But the elections have become a spotlight for them. And all three of them, I would suggest, are explicitly sort of raising the question of equality in one way or the other. So, first, we had a vice presidential debate where a woman who self identifies as both Black and Indian, Kamala Harris, not only participated as the first ever woman of color candidate for vice president, but navigated in full view a constant pressure of being assertive while avoid being described as aggressive. Of course, we know that the attacks on her continued anyway, but many of us may have seen the GIF, I'm speaking, that something, that circulated a lot. And that's something that needs to be understood in the context of a longer history of how women, and particularly Black women and women of color, have to navigate public life, both in politics, but also in other spaces. In addition to the attack that comes when you have an immigrant parent, especially from certain parts of the world, India, Jamaica, where Harris's parents are from, and Kenya, where Barack Obama's father was from, the attack is often in the form of being described as phony, right? Therefore, not belonging here or not a citizen, regardless of whether you are one or not, right? And whose name, of course, feels unfamiliar. We just saw how, there was a comment on Kamala Harris's name. So in addition, you find that women, but also Black women in particular, have to constantly work against the stereotypes of being angry Black women, which is sort of seen in popular culture, and that are also reiterated constantly in politics. For instance, as a political scientist and African American studies scholar Nadia Brown notes, these are distinctly misogynoir tactics. She refers to this combination of racism and sexism that Black women in particular face. So the GIF, right, the GIF that circulated right after the vice presidential election of I am speaking is a reminder, it's an enduring image of an emphatic assertion of equality in face of such attacks. My second point about an enduring image is also that this may be the first time ever that a presidential debate brought up the question of reimagining the police. And again, we cannot speak about this election without thinking about the killings of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd because of the routineness of these acts, where about 1,000 people were killed each year in the last few years. That's the only data we have. And Blacks were killed twice as many times than whites, even though they are 13% of the population. I think the election debate does a disservice sometimes because it polarizes things in terms of how particular parties position themselves, as opposed to how widespread the public support has been on challenging police brutality, with definitely a range of positions within the movement, right? So, even in the time of COVID, right, these were perhaps the largest known mass protests where basically more than 4,000 locations had these protests that Pat was also referring to. But I think this idea of reimagining the police is there to stay for three reasons. One, it is coming out of a public realization or knowledge of the origins of police being in a colonial model, right? What British used in Ireland, but it's also, the origins lie in slave patrols in the South. And even if that was always known, the difference from 2015, when we last saw these protests, to here is basically that there's some recognition that reforms haven't been successful, whether in terms of body cameras or implicit bias training. And because there needs to be a rethinking of a dominant model of militarized police response and broken window policing as a way to deal with communities and structurally produce challenges such as homelessness or mental health and drugs. Third, that there is a global resonance. So I teach and research on policing, but also in a comparative context, and US and India. And whenever now I speak about policing anywhere, the question of sort of reimagining the police is very, very striking in each of these contexts, whether it's about India or the US or any other country. And the reason for that, and why I say that this is an enduring conversation, is because the question of origins, the role police plays, and whose right it protects, and the question of inequality of violence has become central, and is here and anywhere in the world right now to stay beyond the elections. And finally, I sometimes say this in my classes, when we are talking about many sort of polarizing discussions, that we do need to move beyond the binary of a Democratic or Republican or liberal and conservative in framing things. I know it's strange to say that in times of election, but I just want to sort of think about whether one should be also talking about what is the normative standard by which we are looking at a particular issue, right? Many of you may have seen this life of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. There's this RBG, that's a documentary. There's some mention of what a great friendship there was between Scalia and Ginsburg. And that is, truly remarkable, and obviously points to the shifts that Phil was talking about earlier. But I think there is also, and there's this, proof of their friendship where they're sitting on an elephant in India. Basically that's the only scene in which India is sort of shown as this exotic place, but I'll leave that for now. And there's a famous line where Scalia says that what's not to like about Ginsburg, except for, of course, her notion of law, right? And I think at some point we have to ask the question, and I, teach law and political theory, that we have to ask not whether ideology is determining decision making or even a judicial philosophy, right? So within legal theories, we talk about an originalist understanding versus a more evolving notion of a living constitution. But we need to ask whether what is being decided is whether law is fulfilling its ideals of ensuring equality under the law, right? Which is something which is enshrined in the US Constitution, especially since often law has historically excluded many people and continues to do so in practice. So the normative standard then has to be a basis of discussion beyond a binary in politics, right? So I want to sort of end by just thinking about some enduring issues that this unprecedented election, this very important election, has brought, which I think is going to stay way beyond November 3rd. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, Erica.
Great. Well, thank you, Carol. And it's great to see everyone tonight. I'm especially honored to be on this panel as the alum and with my former advisor on campus, Professor Lokaneeta. So just really, really excited about that. And as mentioned, I work on economic policy now, but I've also been on the campaign trail. So I wanted to provide some color on economic recovery and some of those election dynamics. I put together a few slides. I hope you don't mind. I'm going to try to breeze through some of them so we can get to some robust discussion and questions. Great. So a few things I wanted to go over were attitudes about the economy right now. Professor McGuinn talked about how this is the #1 issue people are considering, as well as the effect or impact of stimulus packages and really the overall state of the race. So you'll see I pulled, there's a ton of polling out there. I happen to like Heart and Mind Strategies because they actually track weekly and it's very transparent. You can take a look at everything online. And I just wanted to point out the lower right-hand corner about how people generally feel about the economy right now and where it's trending. So it is trending positively, although slightly. And you'll see about 36% of Americans feel pretty poorly about the economy right now. Now, as far as the perception of another stimulus, and this is actually being pushed, not by coincidence, right before the election down on the Hill, is another stimulus package. And so here you'll see the breakdown or the partisan divide, and who do Americans really blame about there not being a stimulus package right now? Well, 42% blame both parties. I don't think that's super surprising, but you'll see there is some divide between Democrats and Republicans, that Americans blame Democrats less for there not being another stimulus package. So there's actually slightly less accountability there. And I think I just wanted to point out one of the interesting aspects of studying the stimulus is all of the money that has already been authorized by Congress. So you'll see here that in legislative actions, 4.1 trillion has already been authorized. Now only 2.4 trillion as of last week was actually distributed or spent, committed in some way. So it really begs the question, do we need that? It's really not what's represented in the media, or at least anecdotally what I've seen voters are talking about. But I thought it would be worth mentioning kind of where the spending's all going. You will hear voters and candidates on both sides talk about direct payments. And you can see here just how small all of the spending direct payments actually are. I know that there's been some talk that President Trump wants his name on those stimulus checks, and the ones that went out, that some of them took a really long time, but you'll see it's a really small portion of the actual spend that's gone out the door. The other thing that has happened were unemployment bonuses. So for folks who unfortunately lost their job due to either economic shutdown or other impacts of the pandemic, Congress enacted an extra $600 a week on top of normal unemployment insurance. And I pulled this from the Foundation for Government Accountability. They actually highlighted Trump voters, and you'll see there's quite a bit of difference compared to Democrats as whether people supported the $600 extra a week. Now, there was some talk that, especially for small business owners, that provided a disincentive to go back to work. And you'll see here there was really a difference between how much people made and kind of that ability to go back to work. So I have heard, and I think you'll see on the news that's been talked about as far as people bragging. It doesn't necessarily translate though to economic recovery. So wrapping up here, thinking about attitudes about the economy and what will people be really voting about, as far as the issues. I pulled out just, again, how do people feel about the state of the economy really does differ, where Republicans are much more positive than Democrats. Not surprising for the incumbent dynamics that we see. And then I think it's also important to think about balancing COVID-19 response with the economy. Again, Americans have been less nervous about outbreaks as far as trending, but that has gone up this month, probably due to a lot of the advertising that you see by both sides, quite a bit of fear mongering and people not feeling safe. While the economy is talked about as a top issue for voters to care about, I think there's quite a bit to consider with just people feeling safe, right? Do they feel secure? If your family is not secure, you probably can't even think about everything else going on. And you'll see here, this breaks out that it is the #1 issue, although healthcare is a really close second. And especially for Biden voters, really care about healthcare, but the economy is definitely at the top. So what's the state of the race? Kind of close up the panel here before we go into questions and answers. Biden has a significant lead. And again, I think there's a consensus there, at least with polling. Now, Professor McGuinn brought up the Electoral College, which is really the most important thing. And then, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that polls were wrong in 2016, and we were pretty surprised. Professor McGuinn was right, and so was my husband. But all my friends in politics, both sides of the aisle, were pretty sure. And I think 2020, it's not like we have historical precedent for a pandemic. So, you know, we can be surprised, but, you know, I'll end there.
Great. I am going to go ahead and add everyone else to the spotlight. I love this feature. All right. And we actually do have a bunch of questions. Go back to the first one. And we have some comments too. But I want to make sure I get back to the first one. So the first one was kind of goes back to signs. In my Midwest rural community, it is very Republican. I find the huge Trump signs in people's yards to be intimidating if I were an independent. Biden signs are very small. What does this say about the personalities of the candidates?
I will try to answer. I don't know. I think it says more about the personality of the local campaign where you live. The campaigns, the local Republican Party, the local Democratic Party, but also say something about their budgets and what they can afford. I have noticed, looking at signs in New Jersey, the big sign seems to be in. I've seen a bunch of big signs lying around. I've also seen a few in ditches, by the way. I take long walks. That's my unofficial political science research, how many signs get relocated. But it could just be a matter of personal taste of the people working on the campaigns where you live.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would note too, I've been paying a lot of attention. Phil and I live a few blocks away, so we're looking at the same signs. But one of the things I've noticed here, and again, it's New Jersey, right? And this is certainly not a representative sample or representative state, very anecdotal, but I've seen more signs for local, state, and congressional Republican candidates than I have for Trump. And in fact, even in yards where you'll see 3 or 4 pro-Republican candidate signs at the local or other other levels, non-presidential level, you often don't see a Trump sign, which is kind of interesting, right? Because it implies, again, I'm inferring a lot here, right? And I don't know how significant this is, but perhaps that Republican voters are more willing to sort of split their ticket this year than they might be in another year. But I would emphasize too what Phil said. I think again, context matters a lot. If you live in a Democratic neighborhood, you're probably regardless of your enthusiasm, you're probably not putting up a big Trump sign, and vice versa for for Biden. Erica referenced sort of the polls, right? I mean, trying to make sense of what happened with the polls, which weren't that far off, at least in terms of the margins of errors and these things. But people were certainly surprised, right? But to the degree they were off, we think, because there's sort of a social desirability bias, right? With a lot of people then in 2016, and perhaps even more so now in 2020, being perhaps unwilling perhaps to indicate their support for Trump, because they know that in many circles he's unpopular. So the polls may understate now, as they did to a certain degree in 2016, support for Trump. And again, that's the emphasis that leads to the emphasis on voter turnout on the Democratic side, and not taking anything for granted despite the leads that we do see.
Sorry, go ahead. Erica, were you going to say something?
Oh, I was just going to share tactically, having been a campaign operative and run some of these lawn sign operations. They are really for show, at least any kind of legitimate campaign that I've seen. It can signal enthusiasm, especially if they are on people's lawns, so not on public property. The public property is really, that's complete show. But if it's on someone's lawn, hopefully they've agreed to have it on their lawn. And big signs, the kind of red and white standout signs, are always seen as better, right, than little ones that people can't necessarily see. But my motto, at least in training volunteers, is that lawn signs don't vote. So pick up the phone, get on the doors, and that's how you persuade people.
I was just going to say that, I think one of our students, Gabby, she brought up this question about sort of on social media, how younger, voters are sort of writing out their preferences, which is, so again, sort of thinking about what is a traditional sort of mode of showing support, which is the signs, and sort of putting your identification on social media, and to what extent, we see generational differences in that is something that is worth thinking about as well. We could do a psychoanalytical, analysis of large signs versus not, but maybe we'll leave that for now.
Yeah, so just going back to the signs, there are a couple of comments here too that someone notices in Republican neighborhoods in Virginia that he has seen large signs for Republican Senate and House candidates with smaller ones for Trump. And then, large signs in Vermont. Going back to social media, someone did comment on how it's interesting, to have seen the hashtag Bernie 2020, hashtag Trump 2020. And another person is asking, what role, if any, do you see the relatively new platform of social media playing in the outcome of the presidential election?
Well, I mean, the first thing I would say is, obviously, we've never seen a president use social media generally, but Twitter in particular, in the way, with the frequency and I think the effectiveness that Trump has done, right? And that's, he has personalized his presidency, but he's personalized the presidency, and I mean that, I guess, in kind of two ways. He sees the office of the president, and indeed the executive branch, is serving him personally, but he has connected direct lines of communication with his voters, right? Many of his voters, most of his supporters are, I don't know the numbers on this, but I know he's got millions and millions and millions of Twitter followers, right? They get their news from him, about him, right? And that's unfiltered, right? For better or worse. It's better certainly for Trump, right, to have it be unfiltered. And I think they're much more inclined to, to discount the media as fake news, of course, as Trump often does, and to believe, reconfirm their pre-existing support for Trump by virtue of their direct, quote unquote, communication and frequent communication with him.
Our colleague, Carlos Jordan, spoke a couple weeks ago, I think it was 2 weeks ago, and looking at the use of Twitter by the Biden campaign and the Trump campaign. He talked about that. And you can, I don't know if his talk is recorded, but he talked about how they each used it. But I thought one of the points he made really tells the tale, is that using Twitter, whatever you may think of what Trump says, he plays a large role in setting the agenda for what the media then followed that day or that night. Maybe not so much anymore, because initially it was sort of outrageous. Now everybody's sort of used to it, but that probably plays an important role. No one can really match him in his ability to do that. Keep in mind, he understands reality TV. He knows how to move opinion. He knows how to get attention.
Yeah, and the Professor Jordan's talk is recorded, so I'll share that with everyone when I send a follow-up. Next question is, a couple of months ago, I believe the Washington Post shared an opinion piece stating that the popular vote would be used to determine the winner of the 2020 election, which I thought was interesting to see how that was brought up on this election. Any comments on that? It's not really a question as much as a statement, but.
I'm not sure I understand the popular vote would be used to.
Versus the Electoral College, I suppose?
I'm not sure. I don't understand. The Electoral College will ultimately make the choice. It may align with the popular vote.
This may be what the questioner is commenting on, but there's an interesting effort across a relatively large number of states to create basically an interstate compact in which they sign on and agree to have their state's electoral college votes assigned to the winner of the national popular vote, right? So it fundamentally kind of change the the way that the electoral college works to basically, kind of indirectly but effectively make the national presidential election about the popular vote. Now that's that is incomplete. That effort is uncompleted, right? And so it will not certainly be in place yet for this time around. But it does. I mean, it's certainly possible, right? I mean, I think if Trump does manage to win the presidency, it looks, based on the polls, again, a 10-point national lead for Biden, that he would do so in the way he did in 2016, right? Which was very narrowly win a few swing states like Pennsylvania and Florida, maybe Michigan and Wisconsin, right? And lose the national popular vote again, potentially by millions, as he did to Hillary Clinton. So that would be, right, the third time in 20 years in the United States that we would have a president elected into office while losing the popular vote, right? And so that, but again, we said after 2000, there's going to be reform of the Electoral College, right? We said after 2016, oh God, we're going to get rid of this Electoral College, right? Didn't happen either time, right? And so who knows if it would happen after that sort of situation emerged, if it does in 2020.
Okay, I'm going to jump around a little bit, and I want to apologize to anyone. We're getting a lot of questions. If we don't get to yours tonight, we will get to them and we'll respond to you. If you were the campaign advisor for Trump and Biden, what would your strategy be going into the final debate?
Oh my!
I think Trump, I'm sure his advisors are telling him this repeatedly, needs to act more presidential, right, than he did in the first one. And I think Biden has to not make major gaffes, particularly when he's pushed and prodded by Trump. Biden has run for president, we shouldn't forget, many times before, and those previous attempts were often derailed, by gaffes, right? And so, this is a high stakes debate, both because we had one that wasn't really a debate, right? And then the second one was canceled, right? And now here we are 2 weeks out from the election, and to our discussion tonight, Trump's behind. He's playing catch up. He needs, or at least I think I think he realizes, his team realizes, he needs kind of a Hail Mary, right? And this debate coming up is one of his last opportunities to do so. So I am, for one, fascinated to see what happens when Trump's microphone is muted. Phil mentioned reality TV. I mean, that will be a made for TV moment. And so, if you haven't watched presidential debates before, I certainly encourage you to tune into this one, because I think they're going to be, one way or the other, a lot of fireworks.
I think in the first, whatever that was, debate, Biden was followed his training very well, tried not to make any mistakes, and tried to stay with the script. You notice he looked up at the camera a lot and tried to talk to people directly. That was his idea. Trump was doing what he was trained to do as well, but as Chris Christie, who helped get him ready, said he came out a little hot. Trump just became Trump, and Trump, he loses control. Actually, I shouldn't say that. I don't know if he did or not, but I think he thought this is what he has to do in order to dominate that particular scene. I don't know if he can control himself this time, as Pat said. I don't know if I can make it all the way through another one of these things, but I would like to be there the first time President Trump is muted. That might be something for like a world historical moment. So I might like to watch that. Let's see what happens.
So I would just add that basically, I think with Trump, you do think, I mean, there is a particular policy that is being followed even with coronavirus, right? So even if that herd immunity, whatever one may think of, there's something to that, but he obviously doesn't want to sort of put that out there, coherently. But I think it's important for him to make that case just to even keep his crowds enthusiastic, right? They are coming to his rallies, and clearly they have some notion of what they think about the coronavirus issue. But I think for Biden, it's really important that, this idea that, a lot of people are supporting him because it's not Trump is an important one, because you do need to have enthusiasm, right, for voter turnout actually to work in their favor. And so he has to still sort of make a case to parts of the Democratic Party which are more progressive as well, right, to think about how voting is extremely important. And I do think issues like immigration and all also haven't come up, which is very, very interesting at the moment. But I do feel like he has to somehow make an enthusiastic case to particularly young voters. We had a very interesting discussion last week where some of our students were talking about whether it's important to vote or not, right? And they were predominantly sort of the more progressive voters. So I would just say that, hopefully there's some effort to do that too.
And I would add for President Trump, I think it was no surprise when Kellyanne Conway was brought in the last cycle to help soften his image and particularly appeal to women and help with messaging there. She's now more or less off, right? She's not hands-on every day. And so I think, taking that energy, at least the kind of aggressive tone down a little bit, really leaning into accomplishments. Now, there is some entertainment factor as far as putting media into their place, right? That will rile up some of Trump's base. And so I think we saw that with the recent town hall and really just fiery. But, at the end of the day, he needs to lean into his accomplishments over the past 4 years, right? Really share that full story and not get distracted, right? He needs to kind of own that agenda instead of getting distracted, playing blame game and everything else. And as far as Vice President Biden, I think number one thing is security. I mentioned about, economy being, the number one issue, but I do think that safety and security in this country really dictates how people go. And I think with all the, various rioting and policing issues, if I were advising him, I would say really lean into those kind of reforms and show that kind of leadership that perhaps his base feels is lacking from the other side.
Great, thank you. There's been a lot of discussion about increased polarization in American politics, but that doesn't necessarily correlate with the polarization of American society. Do you think there is a greater split in the US between those people who are politically active and engaged and a growing group who are not politically active and engaged?
There may be. I don't know for sure on that. What you're referring to, the question is referring to people becoming disenchanted, disengaging, shutting down politically. That could very well be, but there's been a high level of cynicism in American politics really since the 1970s, Vietnam War and Watergate. really dropped confidence in politics and government down to a low level, from which it's recovered only for a short period of time, a couple of times, usually because of the security issue. So I don't know how much different it is. It could be that those things map onto each other. If you look at the research on how parties have sorted, particularly the rural-urban divide, you also find social differences as well. You can measure that or get a sense of that by looking at the way people think about social issues. So there's probably a split there. That may map onto people who also say government has anything to do with what I want to do, and I'm going to drop out. I'm not suggesting that people are engaged. I don't believe that they are. I think though that the low level engagement, or perhaps another way to put it, that just disenchantment with politics and government probably isn't all that wildly different than what it's been over the last 50 years or so. It hasn't really crawled back from the post-Vietnam, post-Watergate reaction.
Yeah, and to follow up on Phil's point, I mean, I think the low levels of trust, right, and the high levels of cynicism are pretty universal about government and American politicians, and unfortunately that seems to be getting worse, not better. That being said, I think the sort of hyper partisanship is certainly not a universally felt out in the United States. Most people are just not paying attention to politics that much, right, and don't care that necessarily that passionately about party and ideology and what politicians are or not doing. That's confined to a relatively limited number of people who are very engaged and for whom it is very significant, and they're very passionate about it. I would sort of disconnect that argument though from, is American society becoming more divided? And I think the answer there actually is yes, sadly, and then with significant political repercussions. Robert Putnam, a political scientist and sociologist up at Harvard, is Mr. Social Capital, right? And he's a guy who wrote Bowling Alone a number of years ago. He's written a more recent book that I use in my social policy and inequality class called Our Kids. But across his different literature that he's written, his research, he just basically talks about how America is becoming more and more divided, or at least more and more separated by race and class, right? Folks who are of color, right, have really few interactions in schools and communities and neighborhoods, for the most part, with white folks and vice versa, and across class lines as well. Our neighborhoods, our schools are really divided by class, and there's very little sort of interaction across people from different kind of class backgrounds. Increasingly, growing up and living in the United States, you're very isolated from people who look different than you, have a different life experience, and have different levels of resources available to them. And I think that's problematic when we talk about creating a more perfect union, certainly from an equity standpoint, but also being able to sort of communicate and trust one another across different kinds of divisions, political and otherwise.
Can I just, sorry, Erica, were you saying something? Yeah, I mean, I'll just say one thing, which is, I think it's in terms of disenchantment with government, right? I absolutely agree that, there are different spaces in terms of society being more segregated, right? In terms of race and class, disconnect between people. But I do, do want to go back to this thing about what happened this summer, right? The summer reminded people of two things. One, that COVID had the ability to actually impact everybody, right? Even though basically you did have obviously people of color and poor and, frontline workers being impacted much more, but it did create a reality which sort of, became a common common issue, right, for everybody. So even in the even in the statistics that you were showing, Erica, right, healthcare being such a prominent thing is an indication that basically most Americans are worried about, what happens during a pandemic. And the other, that even in the, however we think about sort of the protests that happened, it did go beyond class, race, gender, right? So basically bringing people from all different groups of life, right? So and I think it is a moment which sort of showed a different kind of connection to politics, right, of a particular kind, which I think is also worth noting.
Okay. What do you think the chances are that a third, more progressive party emerges in the next few decades? Or I would lower that. I would lower that within the next several years.
0.
None.
0.
I
Go ahead, Jinee. We set you up for
I
this.
feel like, I mean, yes, it's very hard to break the two-party, right, sort of context. I also feel that to the extent that Bernie Sanders came so close, right, twice, right, to getting the nomination suggests that, basically that still remains sort of a model, right, that can somebody who'd potentially be the more progressive person who might have been a third party candidate at some other moment actually come through the Democratic ticket. Although, that's something, it will really depend on how the Democratic Party sort of sees itself, right? The fact that you had Biden and Hillary Clinton, both establishment candidates to a large extent, suggest that it's going to be very hard for a progressive candidate to come through the ranks of the Democratic Party. But to the extent that Phil is saying now that, it's mostly progressive and liberals, right, who are a part of the Democratic Party, suggests that that path is still open.
Well, and to Ginny's point, right? I mean, the problem with the way the system is set up is that essentially the two parties have to voluntarily give up their own monopoly, right, and permit third parties to have a better shot at getting elected. And clearly it's not in their self-interest to do so. So what you end up with is sort of what Jinee was describing about Bernie Sanders and also about Trump, which is that typically outsiders, right? I mean, Bernie is not a Democrat. He's a socialist, right? Trump really wasn't a Republican either, right? But what you see historically and even in current times is these outsiders who might nominally run as a third party candidate, if that was realistically possible, just try to co-opt one of the two major parties and shift its direction. And as Jinee said, Bernie came very close to doing that, right? Twice, right? The other thing I would note is, feeding off of Phil's polarization piece, we're certainly seeing it in this election, and I think this is the way of the future, for better or worse, is the two parties are going to work really hard to make sure that none of the people who are or their members or who might be inclined to vote for them vote for anybody else in the two parties, right? You're hearing that in the ads right now, right? I mean, Democrats still blame Ralph Nader, right, and the Green Party for siphoning votes off from Gore in Florida and elsewhere and giving the election, fairly or not, to Bush in 2000, right? And so we do see it, small number of independents and third-party candidates getting votes in presidential elections, but the margins are so small in some of these states that actually can make the difference and could make the difference going forward. So I think the parties are actually, the system is probably moving in exactly the other direction, even more and more farther away from third-party candidates and parties being viable, just given this polarization.
If you want to explore it, the idea that the two-party structure is built into the electoral structure of the country, so creating more than two parties is really difficult to do, but you can move one party more in one direction or another. But I'd like to do a plug for a book that I did last time we were together, is Lee Drutman's book called Doom Cycle, which sounds pretty depressing. He's a political scientist, Center for American Progress, I think that's the name of it, and he understands all this stuff, and he is arguing that it's actually possible to create a multi-party system in the United States without a constitutional amendment to change the electoral structure. It's a reach. It's a very, very, very long reach, but at least he's putting it out there for discussion, and it's based on how he thinks public opinion is distributed, which is to say it's not a bell curve, it's actually lumpy, at least 4 or 5 different peaks across public opinion.
Okay. I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll want to wrap it up. Again, if we didn't get to your questions, we'll take a close look at the chat and the questions within it, and I promise we'll get back to you. If the Dems win the presidency and flip the Senate this year, what happens to Trump's unique brand of republicanism? Will his supporters continue to rally around him and his ideas, even if he isn't president? How will he shape the Republican Party going forward, even in a loss this year?
My short answer is, if I were a graduate student in political science right now, I would be hoping that would happen, because that'd make a great dissertation to follow how that's going to go. I don't know where that's going to go. It depends on where the voters are in the Republican Party. Right now, one would think where the Republican Party is in terms of voters, they're not going to embrace a Mitt Romney very easily, or a Jeb Bush very easily. I would think they would still want somebody in sort of a populist conservative mode. However, I don't know how to account for Trump's outsized personality. That doesn't fall easily to any model. It's not easy to measure. We'll have to see how that plays out with how leaders deal with the Republican Party membership as it is.
Yeah, I think there's a segment of the Republican Party, both voters and elected officials at the national and the state level, who are really desperate to move on for Trump. But I think it's hard. You know, he's gotten everybody to fall in line. I mean, almost, you know, universally inside of the party, which to political scientists like myself is really pretty shocking, right? I mean, given, again, A, that he's not a Republican, B, his style and approach, and C, frankly, his policy, you know, being anti-free trade, you know, as a Republican is pretty kind of shocking, not to mention anti, deficit, concerns about the deficit and the budget and spending. But I think there's no heir apparent, right? I mean, Pence, right? I mean, Pence, especially if Trump does well, wins, the Republicans control the Senate, is Pence then carry on sort of the Trump banner? I don't know who else is sort of set, Romney has danced around a little bit with it, but who would take up the banner of the party and return it to its roots, or take it in a different direction away from Trump? I don't know that person is easily identifiable right now.
And I think we've been seeing that rise of illiberalism, so essentially populism and socialism. I'd say as far as the Republican Party front, I think that kind of maybe not a public heir apparent, but it's probably Nikki Haley. I do see both parties going further out to the extreme and kind of that populist wing. It is farther away from free market values, as Professor McGuinn touched on.
I mean, it would be interesting to see whether Nikki Haley will get that kind of support, given that one of the impacts of polarization is makes it very difficult for people seen as outsiders to be able to get that kind of support. So, and this is sort of the post-Obama the kind of backlash we've seen and the kind of attacks that we see with Kamala Harris and so on and so forth. It is true that, prominent Asian, right, particularly Indian Americans actually got more importance in the Republican Party, right? So Nikki Haley or Bobby Jindal, did come up as major figures. But I think in the last few years, the kind of polarization and sort of anti-immigrant sentiment that has come up, you see actually it's becoming much more difficult for certain kind of candidates to get the kind of acceptability in the new kind of Republican Party. So I'm not, I think Nikki Haley did become prominent, but at the same time, it would be interesting to see that, and if Kamala Harris and Nikki Haley come up, that's going to be a very, very interesting sort of combination.
Yeah. And to build off of Ginny's point, I mean, it's sort of hard to see that core, the biggest constituency group of the Republican coalition right now, again, as I alluded to earlier, are non-college educated white men, right, who have really bought into this anti-immigrant rhetoric, right, coming around to support someone like Nikki Haley, regardless of her credentials, right, and her qualifications otherwise, and whether or not she gets the sort of the endorsement of the party establishment.
Okay, any other concluding remarks? Patrick, I know you have some, but
Yeah, I thought, in the spirit of my making a provocative prediction last time around, as Phil alluded to, that Trump had a realistic chance of winning. I think I'd make another one this time around. You guys can all, it's going to be recorded, so you'll have me on tape, and you can come back and call me on it in a little while, and I we'll see what happens. I don't want people to forget about the interregnum period here. I know a lot of folks like myself are like, man, this is crazy. Let's just get through the election day, and and we hope our preferred candidate will win, or at least the election will be over. I mean, kind of country can move on one way or the other. Don't forget, Trump's still president for 2 months right after the election, and the old Congress is in place, regardless of who wins the House or the Senate for 2 months. So we've got this really weird 2-month period during a pandemic, right, where people are really politically agitated, right? Whoever wins or loses and loses this election, the supporters on the other side are going to be really, really upset, right, and angry. We certainly have unfortunately, I mean, I hate to say this, but I think it's realistic, the possibility for a lot of people taking, again, whoever wins, a lot of people taking to the streets, a lot of protests that may well turn violent, a lot of confrontations on the streets. And it's going to be a very, a very volatile time. And let's say, as is, my prediction, the predictions of most folks right now, that Trump loses, he's going to still be president for 2 months. Trump is not known to take losing well, particularly in a context where he's already called out basically said any election in which he loses is illegitimate. Right, so he's already made it clear he will not accept the results of the election if he loses. So what if that happens? And my wife is a clinical psychologist, and so she says if Trump loses this election, he will suffer what is technically called a narcissistic injury. Right, his ego will be dramatically harmed. Right, given the temperament and personality and past actions that we've seen out of Trump, he will, at that point, be unchecked. Right, I mean, to the degree he's been checked at all to this point. It's been the prospect of having to stand for re-election. That will be over come the first week of November. Again, whether he loses or wins, but obviously particularly if he loses. So how will he respond? Very unpredictable for sure. This is perhaps our most unpredictable president we've ever had, certainly in my lifetime. But what if he becomes, takes more radical kinds of steps around suppressing protests, right? He's been pretty aggressive about that already to this point. What if he refuses to accept the election even after Congress, say, certifies the result? What if the Senate, so here's the scenario. Trump loses, we've got this 2-month period where he becomes increasingly, or perceived to be increasingly, unhinged or taking dangerous actions. The Republicans have lost the Senate, right? And they blame Trump for that. Right? Maybe the Democrats would certainly move to impeach in the House, and that would pass, right? But maybe a handful of Republican senators, particularly those who have now been voted out of office, would actually vote to remove. So that's my prediction. If Trump loses, he's going to act in a dangerous way that's viewed dangerously. And if he loses the Senate Republicans enough of them will vote to remove him from office. There's my prediction.
Holy smokes, Pat.
I told you to be provocative.
My goodness. I have nothing to top that except if he were impeached and removed, would he go?
Not easily.
I think we have to look at other parts of the world while thinking about the US, is what I would say.
Slightly different, but kind of closing thoughts here is that we do have new dynamics in New Jersey with ballots being mailed out to registered voters. So instead of turning out in person, if you do turn out in person, it's provisional paper only unless you have a disability, and then there's actually a machine for you. But I think we're going to just see very different results, right? Given this type of new type of election, right? Now that's different around the country. I've been studying Florida, diving in there, and I didn't look what it is this week, but the other week it was something like more than 50% of Republicans had not voted yet, and Democrats were way up there for who had returned their mail-in ballots so far. So I think there is this group, perhaps the folks who watch Tucker Carlson at night, right? They hear about all of the mail fraud going on I should mention just a town next door to me, the mail truck was set on fire earlier this summer before the primary, so it's not totally unheard of. And I think we're going to see those folks turn out in person in states like Florida. Now, to what degree? That's what will be the surprise here, as far as we don't have any precedent. The data analysis, we can't go back in time and see it. So a few more things to think about.
Well, thank you all so very much for doing this. I hope everyone enjoyed it. Again, we'll get to the questions in chat that we didn't get to. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to email alumni@drew.edu and we'll pass them along and get an answer to you.